So it's a pleasure to welcome you back. I hope you had a good day yesterday. I enjoyed it, yeah. I see some positive sign there over. I enjoyed it. I thought it was most interesting and fruitful. A little exhausting too, but it was good. I think we had some fun, and hopefully you made new friends and exchanged business cards and will stay in contact ever after. So it's great to see you on our second and unfortunately last day here. We will hopefully do it again, not immediately, it's too much work to do it immediately, but at some time in the future we will hopefully again ask you to come and join us for another Global Policy Forum. Today, the day is focused on China, China and its international relations, China and its allies, China and its partners, and of course China and the United States, China and Europe. And we have already 5 distinguished speakers and 5 distinguished respondents plus 1 moderator. So let me briefly introduce everyone, and then we go as yesterday. Now everyone has 6 minutes. The respondents have 4 minutes. And I have Jason here, who is our feared timer, who will interrupt you rudely after 5.5 minutes. When will your phone go off?
6 minutes.
6 minutes, okay, good. So we'll start in a minute with Dennis Wilder. Dennis Wilder is a well-known Foreign Office State Department official and an intelligent guy and a national security member during various administrations, and he now teaches at Georgetown University. Is responsible for their China program. He has lots of experience on China, so we are very interested what he has got to tell us. Then Robert Gerber, also former State Department official, who now is with the think tank on the Presidency and Congress in Washington, D.C. Then David Yu, who is perhaps unique among our speakers and respondents because he's a professor of finance rather than politics. And he teaches both in New York and in Shanghai at the Stern School, New York University Stern School. So he will give us a slightly different dimension, I would assume. And Michael Cunningham, who is a scholar at Taiwan University, and he used to be at the Heritage Foundation, and he used to do many other things. He is also a great China expert, so great to have you here. And of course, the most famous local China expert is Kaiser, who is of course not just known locally, but he lives in Chapel Hill, but he's nationally known for the Sinica podcast and for many other things he has done. And of course, for those of you who are into the music scene, Kaiser is a well-known musician and a founding member of the Chinese rock band Tang Dynasty. It's a hard rock band, and if you haven't heard it, it's available on YouTube. It's actually very, very good. So the YouTube clicks on your videos will go up steeply in a minute. So. It is great to see all 5 speakers here, and we will come to the respondents in a little while. So let's start with Dennis Wilder, please.
Well, thank you, Klaus, and thank you to the sponsors in Chapel Hill for inviting me. I have never been here. Coming from an urban campus, it's nice to see wide open spaces. I think the entire Georgetown campus probably fits into your quad out here. We are tiny by comparison. Let me start today to talk about the Chinese military and the amazing things that are going on in the Chinese military. By the way, it's not often that I have members of the Chinese military in the audience while I'm talking about it, so they may want to weigh in at some point. China is modernizing its military equipment at a torrid pace. Really unseen since the United States did it in World War II. Somebody mentioned yesterday the United States building 100 aircraft carriers during World War II. Well, the Chinese very much are doing the same with their shipbuilding capability, aircraft carriers, destroyers, frigates, drone carriers now. The level of production based on this huge manufacturing base, 100 shipyards, gives the Chinese a quantitative advantage that we simply cannot meet. One of the areas, 300 plus new intercontinental ballistic missile sites are being built in China. With these sites, assuming each missile will have 3 warheads, the estimate from the Department of Defense is in the next 10 years, they will grow to 1,500 deployed nuclear warheads. That will almost achieve the level we and the Russians have. We have about 1,700 and the Russians about equal deployed. This is a big change. For many years, the Chinese had what was called a assured retaliation capability. They only had 24 ICBMs, and those 24 ICBMs were designed to strike back at Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, major American cities, and population centers if China was attacked. With these new capabilities and a huge command center being built just south of the city of Beijing, the Chinese are now moving to what we would call launch on warning or launch under attack. And what this means is with the sophisticated sensors in space and other systems, they will be able to detect an attack as soon as the missile is fired either from the sea or from the land. At that point, China would fire back immediately and would not go after population centers, but rather after command and control, missile facilities. This is a huge strategic change, and it is one that we need to follow very closely. One of our problems, that's one of our problems. One of our problems is that we have absolutely no contact with Chinese strategic forces. We have tried but failed to engage them. So unlike with the Soviet Union after the Cuban Missile Crisis, where we were able to create guidelines, understand each other, Americans went to their ICBM facilities, they came to ours, we have no contact. We know very little about their forces, their alert status, their fail-safe systems, and this is a very real danger to the world. Now, China, though, has a lot of hurdles to overcome with their military. First of all, China does have a 300-ship Navy going to 400. We have about 278 ships. But the Chinese Navy has fought one battle at sea in its entire history, and that was in 1975, where a poor group of South Vietnamese sitting on the Paracel Islands were attacked in an amphibious invasion by the Chinese, hardly a major sea battle. So the Chinese Navy has no concept of what it's like to be under fire, what it's like to have aircraft carriers operating 24 hours a day, whereas, as you know, we've been at war for 20 years. Our Navy is very, very well trained. Second problem the Chinese have is joint operations. If the general were here this morning, and I think we have other military here, they could tell you about Goldwater Nichols. And Goldwater Nichols was a change in the U.S., very dramatic, to joint operations. In other words, the Navy is white, the Air Force is blue, the ground forces are green. We talk about fighting purple. Integration of forces into a smooth combat capability. Well, if you look at the Chinese military today, it is still dominated by green suitors. It is still very oriented to that. My final point is terrible problems in the Chinese military with both corruption and questions of loyalty. Xi Jinping has purged a huge number of generals, purged 3 off the Central Military Commission. There has been terrible corruption within the building of missile systems and other systems. Now, we had this problem in World War II. People forget that Truman, as a congressman, actually ran hearings because there was so much corruption in the process during World War II of building weapon systems, and they were defective. ships fell apart, broke in half because of bad steel. So this is not uncommon when you start to spend huge amounts of money on defense. But I think it's very unlikely that Xi Jinping is going to attack Taiwan anytime soon. I don't think he has faith in his military now, and I think he worries about the level of military readiness.
Thank you. Let's go to Robert Gerber. Yeah.
Good. Thank you, Dennis and Klaus. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to speak on a different topic, equally important, I believe, which is economics and trade. We are all familiar and have watched really with awe and amazement at China's economic rise since, let's say, the mid-1990s. China has become a rather extraordinary manufacturing center for the world. It's lifted millions of its own citizens out of poverty. Anyone who goes to China will be dazzled by the high-speed trains they have. In fact, I wish we had trains like that connecting us in Washington, D.C. here in the United States. So really tremendous progress with growth of 5, 6, 7% per year. So how did China get to this level of growth and economic success? Well, it was through a very concerted trade strategy. And for students of history, going back to the 1990s, I remember Congress debating whether we should allow China to accede to the World Trade Organization. And I believe that process was completed around the year 2000 for People's Republic of China. There was a lot of optimism in Congress and at the White House that welcoming China into the World Trade Organization would create both an economic opening and a political opening that would benefit the United States and the West. There were some skeptics in Congress at the time, of course. And China, I would state that when China joined the WTO, it looked at the WTO rules as more like guidelines. It took great advantage of exploiting some of the exceptions that it had as a non-market economy. China soon put restrictions on foreign investment requiring technology transfer or forced partnering. There were problems with intellectual property theft. Western companies lost valuable intellectual property. And then later on, moving forward, China implemented a very ambitious strategy that came to be known as the Belt and Road Project, which involved China building ports, acquiring mines, and building railways around the world so they could, instead of just export things around the world, they could be part of that value chain to get products to customers. And later, we saw a civil-military fusion, which sees companies that have a strong relationship with the PLA and the Chinese Communist Party, and so they were blurring the lines between what is a private company and what is a state-owned company. And China's subsidies were something that the WTO wasn't able to reckon with. All of this caused stress for the industries in the West, in Europe, and the United States. And certainly in 2016, the candidate President Trump, when he ran for president, capitalized on this, and it made it a cornerstone of his campaign along with immigration reform. I believe that was part of his success in winning in 2016. He then negotiated a deal with China that would try to rebalance the trading relationship. The United States had and still has an enormous trade deficit in goods with People's Republic of China, and that deal was heralded by the White House as a giant breakthrough. It was very unique and strange because it involved China agreeing to purchase a certain amount of American goods, and that was not something you normally see in a trade agreement. We can look back on that and say that deal, the terms of that deal were not particularly upheld very well. A quick anecdote about how China's presence around the world today. There's a great movie, a documentary called Lithium Rising, and it was created by the Bertelsmann Foundation. And in that, they interview a cobalt mine worker in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And the cobalt worker says that he gets paid by the amount of cobalt that he extracts from the ground. And he says, and they say, well, how much do you get for this cobalt? And he said, I never know, because there's only one buyer, le Chinois. There's only one buyer that's there in the town, and so the Chinese control the price of the cobalt that comes out of the ground, which just signifies that when you have the mine, you have the transport, you can control the price, you can have an extraordinary impact on the world economy. And so that's an example of how China has been able to control the value chain of many products that are really important to economies of the world. In conclusion, I want to just bring it back to President Trump. When President Trump was first elected, he had a view that if the United States has troops in a foreign country, right, stationed in a foreign country, we should not have a trade deficit with that country, because then the United States is paying twice, right? We're paying for your security and we're paying you for imports. And that is why he first raised tariffs on Europe, Japan, and South Korea. At the same time, he also raised tariffs on China and had a much more aggressive economic defense against China. I would like to posit today that the first strategy that he had against the Allies undermines the second strategy. In order to compete with China, the United States needs to work with our allies, Japan, South Korea, and the European Union, to strengthen our economies, to make sure that we maintain our economic prosperity, and to make sure that the world trading system is a fair one where everyone plays by a certain set of rules. Thank you.
Thank you. Michael Cunningham, do you want to proceed?
Let's try through the.
Yeah, this one's quite good. Yeah, great. Well, I'm going to sort of take a step back and talk about a different perspective. And I'm not refuting anything that has been said by anyone, but I'm trying to, from the best of my understanding, talk about some of these security issues from the perspective of the Chinese leadership. Now, I am not a defense analyst. I'm an analyst of China and of their political system and their politics. And so I'm going to use this perspective. Now, I want to, first of all, push back a little against the title of this, this discussion, China and its allies. China doesn't have allies. It doesn't do alliances. It has one ally, North Korea, which is an embarrassment. It's a troublemaker for China. It doesn't make it look good. North Korea is viewed in China, among most people, very similarly to how it's viewed in the United States and in the rest of the world. So I'm not being nitpicky about wording here. I think this is really important. It's essential for understanding China, for understanding how they view the security environment, and how they look at potential conflict scenarios. So, you know, people talk a lot about the authoritarian axis. Some people call it CRINC, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. And there tends to be this, and it can be helpful to understand the range of security challenges, but people tend to see it sort of as if China, as the stronger partner, is sort of orchestrating everything and giving directions, and the others are like, yes, great leader, we will go and do what you have commanded. And that couldn't be farther from the truth as far as I can tell. China wishes it had more influence over North Korea and Russia and what they do. But at the same time, we have to understand that these are strategic partnerships, very strong, very firm strategic partnerships. The tendency some have to view China-Russia relations, for example, as a marriage of convenience is, you know, we look at it that way at our own peril, because they are very robust, very strong partnerships. They have lots of mutual interest. in particular in opposing U.S. global leadership. A lot of the norms in the U.S.-led system they see as detrimental to their interests, and they would like to replace them with norms that are more more beneficial to their interests. But you know, they are not alliances. China has enough security challenges of its own. It has land borders with 14 countries, almost all of which it has a complicated history with, many of which it has active border disputes with. It has additional maritime borders with many countries and tons of disputes. It inhabits a region full of powerful countries with strong militaries: Russia, Japan, South Korea, India, just to name a few. Rest of border regions. And adding on to that, the U.S. has China surrounded with our own allies. And so, you know, China is not going to try to outcompete the U.S. in alliances. It's trying to delegitimize alliances as a relic of a less civilized era, and sort of try to make U.S. alliances more burdensome. So, you know, and I think the most important thing here is China doesn't want to put itself on the hook to expend its military resources to defend one of these less powerful partners that it has. Now, it could join a war to support one of its partners, but it would do so because it sees it as in its national interest to do so. It would have to be a very strong national interest imperative, but it would do so in that case not because it has accepted some kind of a security commitment to come to a partner's aid. It would see that as very negative for its own security. So, shifting gears just slightly, you know, Taiwan. That's what all the talk is on right now. And, you know, how important is Taiwan to China and to its leaders? Well, it's pretty important, but that leads to a different outcome than I think most people look at it. So Taiwan is often promoted as like the ultimate prize or part of Xi's legacy. Well, the CCP propaganda has been pretty clear about what Xi's legacy is. It is that under Mao, China stood up. Under Deng, China became rich. Under Xi, China became powerful. They do not want under Xi, China wasted all of its military strength and threw away its chance at a great rejuvenation. The great rejuvenation essentially is Xi's legacy. But more important than his legacy is to hold on to power. That's baked into the political system. That's how it is. So the government is under no pressure to seize Taiwan, but it's under immense pressure not to lose its claim over Taiwan. So it could lose its claim by failing to prevent Taiwan de jure independence, or by trying to resolve the Taiwan issue and failing. This is a very difficult issue for China's leadership. Once they make the fateful decision to go in and attack Taiwan or to try to resolve it in any way, they have to be ready for it to turn into a kinetic war. And once that happens, we're talking destruction of China's military, probably attacks on mainland China. They're sending only children to war, eliminating entire family lines, and I'm wrapping up right here, but also eliminating much of the working age population that is needed. It would, I guess, help them with youth unemployment in the short term, but they wouldn't, who would support the aging population going forward? Huge issue. Not to mention, I haven't even gotten into the economic challenges that would result from a war. Tons there as well. But anyway, just to summarize and conclude, China is highly unlikely to try to attack Taiwan and force unification unless and until its leaders determine that the risk of not doing so exceeds the risk of doing so.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
let's go to Kaiser.
Good, thank you. I think I want to also make my intervention sort of very much in the spirit of Michael's just now, and try to channel to the extent possible what things look like in the economic sphere from China's perspective, and push back a little bit, maybe, or maybe rather than push back, maybe to sharpen what Robert said, where he was looking sort of backward at the last 20, 30 years. I want to try to look at how Beijing sees the next few years, we just saw them come out of the fourth plenary session of the 20th Party Congress. We've been all poring over these documents that emerged from the fourth plenary session in the run-up to the release of the 5-year plan, so I want to look at that. I also want to, do this in very much the same spirit of I'm surprised that he worked for the Heritage Institution, given what he just said. I think I can see why you used to work there. No longer work there anymore. We used to think of that development sort of worked like a ladder. We had this idea of the flying geese model, where as China advanced into more advanced areas of manufacturing, it would shed the lower value add. It would allow room. It would vacate the lower rungs of the ladder to allow developing countries to ascend. That is not what's happening. This is not a matter right now of anything but deliberate policy, and I will get into that. China's old model, the property infrastructure exports that we're all very familiar with, has really run its course. I think the Chinese leadership is very well aware of that. It's deflated its property market very much on purpose with the implementation of these 3 red lines that it has not backed off on significantly. It has deliberately deflated this massive property bubble. Infrastructure returns are very much diminishing. New projects are slowing. The debt overhang is quite acute. Beijing has made it very clear that it's not going to solve its problems today with cash handouts, with a massive stimulus, for various reasons. So what replaces it is what I really want to go into today. And the answer is what Chinese leaders now call, and you've heard this phrase before, the development of new quality productive forces. In plainer language, I think that means a full spectrum, and it's very important that we recognize a full spectrum push into advanced manufacturing, supported, of course, by an abundant amount of state-directed investment, big investments in research, and dense industrial clusters, dense industrial ecosystems. I think, again, the key phrase is full spectrum. China is not simply climbing the old value chain and leaving the low end behind as Japan, as Korea, as Taiwan did. It's actually trying to dominate the whole range. Everything from what James King recently called the $6 toaster all the way up through electric vehicles and, industrial robots. Machine tools, advanced batteries, shipbuilding, as we've heard, aerospace components, things like that. And of course, AI, which we'll get into in the following session. All of this, of course, powered by a modern and very enviably robust grid with shrinking dependence on fossil energy. So automation, of course, and scale mean Chinese factories can keep the cheap, low-margin production while continuing to crank out increasingly sophisticated products. The bottom rungs are not being vacated. This is very, very important. That is a genuine break with the older pattern. It makes sense when you remember that China is really a continent, not just a nation state. So except if you want to avoid tariffs, as China has done to some extent, there is no reason to move your manufacturing to Cambodia or to Thailand when China itself contains many Cambodias and Thailands. Why not move it to a less developed region where you will see the same benefits accrue that you have seen in the richer coastal areas? So from Beijing's point of view, the model is quite internally coherent, though. Politically, it really preserves industrial employment. We really need to understand a lot of what the state-directed lending to state-owned enterprises is about. A lot of it is essentially a welfare program. It's about maintaining industrial employment, which is crucial to maintaining social stability, of course. It ties growth to obvious national security priorities, semiconductors, as we've seen, green tech, the energy transition. And we need to understand what China is fundamentally doing here is transitioning their economy onto a different post-carbon foundation. This is the whole game. And of course, as Michael said, it keeps the party in control of the commanding heights. Economically, it also really plays to China's real strengths. China has these deep industrial clusters. They never stop making things. They understand how important process knowledge is, and the retention of process knowledge is to continuing innovation. Its financing institutions can support priority sectors in ways that would be politically impossible in most democracies of the world. So this is not the rules that we've played by in the West traditionally. These are a very, very different set of rules. Despite all the talk of boosting consumption, and Chinese economists also talk about boosting consumption, there are very obvious real obstacles to this. Local governments are very heavily indebted. The property bust has made households very, very cautious. The social safety net is not fully in place. They have not made the kinds of changes to the hukou system, which you heard about yesterday, that really would need to be made. That capacity, so what it's done is it's really doubled down into this supply side approach. It wants to have its firms build better and more attractive products, better services, to boost consumption from making the supply side simply more attractive. Despite all the talk about boosting consumption, what we have really is going to be more factories, more equipment, more technology, and that is going to have to find markets in the rest of the world. The external surplus is not a byproduct. It is actually quite baked into the model, and there will be increasing friction, but not with everybody. The friction will be mainly with other countries that engage in advanced manufacturing. So in Japan and South Korea, of course, in its own neighborhood, and of course with Germany, other countries in Western Europe, and chiefly with the United States. But it's almost inevitable that we're going to see then, more tariffs, more anti-dumping, more local content rules, more de-risking, more friend-shoring. We can't dismiss these as just emotional, irrational responses. This is, there are real, I think, political responses. These are to a real fear. Another wave of deindustrialization will feed another wave of populism. We are in for a China shock 2.0. I don't mean to make any kind of moral imputations here.
Thank you very much indeed. And last but not least, David Yu.
Hi everyone. Listening to the different speakers, I want to take a step back and just relook at kind of what's happening. If you look at kind of cross-border and relations with China among other countries, it all comes down to fundamentally the economy, right, is a big part of it. And we'll kind of do a recap in the sense that what has happened in the last, I would call it since 2010, right, post-Olympics, is basically, if you look at it, there's been a big run-up in investment, both domestically as well as inbound FDI, foreign direct investments. And this has really fueled lots and lots of infrastructure, CapEx-heavy industries, and this is where we see today, remnants of which factories and railroads and other industrial capacity is today. There was lots and lots of dialogue and in-person dialogue, to be frank, and I think today we see very, very little of that. I have been living in Beijing and Shanghai and in DC and among other places, 10 other countries, and that's very, very concerning to me. And because basically a lot of folks are telling me things and analyzing it from the position of reading papers and data, alternative data, more so these days than other sources. But really telling me this is what I think because I see this in the realm. And I go, well, that's great. But ultimately, like all partnerships, it's about relationships, fundamentally long-term relationships and short-term relationships, right? Whatever, with the flow of things. And you see what's happening recently, coming back to the economic point. You see as Michael was saying about the housing situation that has been a big deflator of the economy. It's about 1/3 of the economic GDP, about 1/3 of GDP from ancillary and other remnants points of view is a very important part. Because you also have to look at kind of where does this money kind of flow to? Flows into outside real estate investments. If you look at a lot of these groups, there's a lot of family-owned groups, a lot of state-owned groups, but also a lot of private groups, and they have done lots of major outbound real estate investments around the world, right? You look at New York, you look at like Waldorf Astoria as a big, flagship example. But you look at in Malaysia, like the big cities that has been built. These are all kind of remnants of it. But ultimately, I would say it's taken a big deflating shock, and it's going to be very, very difficult because restructuring is difficult in all circumstances. I don't know if any of you guys have done it, but I've taken out restructured companies out of bankruptcy, shipping companies out of bankruptcy. It's tough. Well, you have so many interests, diverging interests, they all want certain things, and you have to have lots of these discussions, these relationships. So I use that as an analogy of going forward, what's going to happen. I think there's one thing about there's difficulties, but there's also ways to get out of it. But it's going to take a while because of these things have to shake out. No one's going to accept something unless A, they're forced to because someone tells them to do it by dictate, or because they're fundamentally forced to because there's no other better option. You're stuck in the back corner, which is a lot of times what happens in these negotiations. You're back to a point where there's no other points. So coming back to economy and going forward, there's a big difference between the national economy and the local economies. I think this because of the way it's fundamentally funded, right? The local economies, if you look at kind of how its purse strings work, it's selling land, selling real estate, taxes, of course, and really they don't have a aspect of raising local municipal bonds like here in the U.S., right? You can only do it through local government finance vehicles and really kind of a roundabout way of doing it. But that has been really very pressured at the moment. And ultimately it comes down to if you invest in those, how do you get returns back? That's a fundamental question. So if you invest in things where you're investing, say, $1 and you're getting less than that in return, you're never going to catch up over time, and that's going to catch up and bite you eventually. And we're starting to see some of that because of low return on investment capital. Other things have very high degrees of investment capital. I know, so we're going to talk about AI, but really, I would say education has been a big boost in that sense. Education, some of this aerospace things that I've seen, there's a lot of money coming in. Okay, creating opportunities in the future. National government, totally different aspect. There's a lot of capacity for additional debt capacity, money going into various projects. But from my cross-border perspective, it's been a giant pullback, actually, in a lot of ways. And especially, it's a balance between state-owned enterprises and POEs, private-owned enterprises, right? Historically, it was all private, state-owned enterprises, a lot of national research, oil, et cetera. And then there was a flood in the 2010s of private enterprises backed by debt, mostly. That has pulled back, and now it's the rise of state-owned enterprises again. Ultimately, the question comes down to who is a better allocator of capital? As a person who does it day in, day out, that's my question, is how do you figure when is a good project not? And I would say that most governments in the world, if not all, are very poor at it. And basically, the question is, how do you kind of let go enough to be able to get that extra kick? Same thing in the U.S., I would say, with some of the larger aspects of what we're trying to do here in the U.S. as a nation. So with that, there's a lot of different subsectors to go in, but industrial capacities to continue, large aspects into production will continue, and we'll see how it comes out of the restructuring of the debt crisis, et cetera.
Thanks a lot. Yeah. let me hand over to Mary Weiss of the US Army, and you will deal with the respondents.
Oh, here. Is this one on?
Yes.
Okay. All right. First, we're just going to start right over here to make it easy with the microphones. So I'd like to introduce Dr. James Lindsay. He's a distinguished senior fellow of U.S. foreign policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. Do you want to come up?
Sure.
Okay.
Whatever you want.
All right.
Again, thank you. It's a great delight to be here. Klaus, thank you for inviting me. I want to thank the panelists for a stimulating set of remarks. I am not a China expert, so I'm not going to pretend
None of us are.
to be a China expert. What I want to do is really just raise three questions based on what I heard here this morning that I think are really worth considering. First question really is, what is it that China or Xi Jinping want? We heard a lot of very good commentary here about what China is doing, but I think it's important to step back and ask, where do we think Chinese grand strategy, if I can use that political science term, is headed? Now, I realize that's perhaps the hardest question of all to answer, but I think we need to ask ourselves, what do we think China is trying to accomplish? There are arguments that China is seeking global dominance. Others would argue it's seeking regional dominance, particularly a notion that it wants to be sort of the unipolar, unipolar power in Asia and wants a multilateral world elsewhere. Others would argue that it's just all being made up as they go along, despite all of the party papers and what have you. And again, related to this question of what China wants, to the extent Chinese grand strategy is about decentering the United States, ending American hegemony, as is often phrased, will China like that world? Because there's an argument to be made that China's tremendous, rapid, perhaps unprecedented growth over the past 3 decades was predicated on a world that America built. And that if America is not there, many of those foundations that enabled China to succeed will evaporate as well. Second question is, are there areas that the United States and China can actually come to an agreement on? I mean, we talked a lot yesterday about concerns about having a major power war, and let me undermine, a major power war, even if it didn't go nuclear, would be horrific. The death total would be outstanding. It would be something I don't think people, at least of my generation, can imagine. Perhaps people even older than me can remember World War II. It would be that scale of devastation. But on the question of Taiwan, for example, which is a flashpoint, is there an outcome there that would be mutually agreeable? Is it sufficient if the United States just declines or it refuses to endorse Taiwanese independence? Would that be enough to keep the status quo? Or is the status quo something that's inevitably going to fall apart? On the issue of manufacturing, China right now accounts for about 31% of the world's manufacturing output. It's flooding the world with manufactured goods. Yes, this is a problem for advanced manufacturing economies, but it's also a real problem for other countries. I think Brazil, for example, which has gone and imposed a lot of tariffs because it's worried about its domestic manufacturing and its jobs being wiped out by China. And the third question I would have as we sort of think about these issues is, does the United States have the right strategy given what we think China is going to do? Does it have the right military strategy? We talked a lot yesterday about how to reconfigure military forces. There's a question of are we maintaining the right alliances? Are our allies doing enough? Are they doing the right things? Those are all big questions. There's a real question about the economic response. China clearly is an economic juggernaut. Every day my email inbox is full of new stories about how China's outpacing the United States on a slew of big technological issues. We talked about green energy, but it's not that. Next session we're going to talk about AI. I saw a recent study of 64 major technologies in China. The argument was leads in 57 of them. That is something to keep in mind. And then the real question is on the diplomatic front. Is the United States maintaining the diplomatic posture that it needs to be able to compete with China in a more competitive world? I will note right now this month, or last couple of weeks, the United States has boycotted the COP30 meetings in Brazil. We're not going to the G20 meeting in South Africa. There's a saying in diplomatic circles that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And I think there's a real question here for the United States going forward as to whether or not we're doing what we need to do to manage the competition with China, particularly in a way that does not take us to war. And I'll stop there.
Thank you for those comments. Next, I'd like to introduce the Honorable Mark Kennedy. We heard some about his bio yesterday, but just want to remind you that he's the founding director of the Wahba Initiative for Strategic Competition at New York University. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, and a great conversation. Let me reply to all of them. First of all, Robert, I fully agree that we need our allies when we're engaging with China, not fracturing that at the same time. I would say to Michael, you mentioned that Russia may not be an ally, but I think the real challenge for us is that it creates a two-front situation. If China ever did something that would be highly opportunistic for Russia, and we have not recognized fully in our plan, our defense plans, that we need to be prepared for a two-front conflict. David, you talked about government as a poor allocator. We're hoping that's what we're relying on, because if we get too discouraged, we can just think through that and understand that it's our entrepreneurial system that'll pull us forth. Ben, you talked about them being opaque as it relates to nuclear. That's part of the strategy. If you're really going to understand China, you need to understand, we think like Clausewitz, a decisive battle to win. They think like Sun Tzu, which includes that deception and win without ever fighting. We play chess, capture the king. They play Wen Chi or Go, which is surrounding and deception. And I'm sure that Leah will talk about ports, but the rare earths and all that supply chains. But Kai, you talked about, and just to put a frame around yours, a big part of the strategy that is not talked about enough is the dual circulation. As Kai did a good job of pointing out, they're making the world dependent on them, whether it be for batteries or rare earths or the EVs or machine tools. And they have that manufacturing juggernaut that they're 75% more of a manufacturer than we are, even though we used to be the biggest. And they're intent on keeping that. They're using 12 times more robots at a much lower income. When you adjust that for their income base, 12 times more robots than us to keep that manufacturing base. We're focused on manufacturing jobs. We need to be focusing on manufacturing. But the other piece of that is that we'll talk about in the next session, they're making themselves less dependent on us. Whether or not that allocation of assets into the technology to be less dependent on us is inefficient, they're achieving their goal of not being dependent on the West, but having the West be dependent on them. And the final thing I would just say as it relates to that manufacturing flood going out into the markets, that's again a possible hope for us, because the Brazils and others that are going to be swamped by all that will start to be resentful. They've had the lead in the global south with all they've done with Belt and Road, but hopefully them swamping the rest of the world with their manufacturing excess will reduce their affection for China as it's undermining their own markets. So thank you for a very robust conversation.
Are you okay to come up, or do you want me to put my foot there? Okay. Thank you, sir. Next, I want to introduce Dr. Vita Golod. She's a junior research fellow at the AU Kreminsky. Did I say that right? Close enough. Okay. Institute of Oriental Studies, National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. She's also a visiting adjunct instructor at UNC-Chapel Hill, and she's the co-founder of the Ukrainian Platform for Contemporary China and a board member of the Ukrainian Association of Sinologists. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Klaus, for the invitation. And I'm very comfortable here in this environment because yesterday was a real advocacy day for Ukraine. Ukraine was mentioned 37 times, and it's really a pleasure for me. And I feel in a friendly environment. And of course, in that part of the world, in transatlantic view, it's no doubt who is victim and who is an aggressor. But in the Indo-Pacific, in that part of the world, in Asia, I would say the ambiguity persists. That's why it's the biggest problem for Ukrainian diplomats and for public diplomacy as well. So, talking about today's discussion, China is very important, plays very important role in security in every single region, including Ukraine. And my narrow expertise is Sino-Ukrainian relations, and I will talk in the second section more in details how we deal with China's flexible diplomacy, I would say. And I'd like to give one remark about that China doesn't have allies. Yes, I agree, but China has its own zones of influence using formats like a G77+1 in the United Nations, BRICS, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, having the same result, but still having their high level of flexibility, which is really, really important. So yesterday, and actually China requires respect to the existing international order. And that's why I'd like to give a remark. Yesterday, Madam Ambassador said that European pressure on China has not worked, and I can explain why. Because Ukraine is still, from Beijing's view, in the Russia's zone of influence. And still, in Chinese Minister of Foreign Affairs, our file, Ukraine belonged to Eurasian department, not to European department. And we are working really hard to change it. So, and some few points I'd like also to address. Nobody mentioned about Modi's visit to China just recently, attending Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So it is a security issue. And my question is, does it mean Quad is not longer active? And I think it's really important to say today. And another question is Taiwan. And we know Joseph Wu, the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Taiwan, he often compared Ukraine with Taiwan. He said defending Ukraine means defend Taiwan, which is, I really don't like this comparison because Ukraine is a dependent state, but I want to say that outcome of the war in Ukraine will define security in the Indo-Pacific as well. So we have to keep it in mind. And also, if you'd like to know how countries will act in the case of conflict in the Taiwanese Strait. Just look in the Ukraine case, how Japan and South Korea and Australia and India react to this conflict. It's really important. Ukraine, it's a case study in this region as well. Japan and other countries maintained a very cautious approach over over this conflict, providing kind of support. I would say humanitarian or diplomatic support, but no weapons and no any intelligence service, which is absolutely understandable because because Taiwan is another flashpoint and a security concern for the whole world. Thank you for that, and I will share my personal expertise in the next section. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, next I'd like to introduce Mr. Klaus Becker. He's the chairman of the NC Zeitgeist Foundation and the president of, did I say Nairo Steel? Is that right? Nairo Steel? An international steel trading company. He formerly served as German Honorary Consul and president of the Charlotte German-American Chamber of Commerce. Welcome.
Good morning. Thank you very much for the nice introduction. You know, that was more complete than I thought. You know, and Klaus, thank you very much for I'm very honored to be here because, thank you for the invitation, because I'm kind of an oddball here. I'm a steel trader. I'm not a venerable diplomat or academician or a scholar. I know China out of a micro micro view, and so I will not try even to compete with the statement of the others, which are always talking about China. But I assume when I look at you that many of you might not have been in China and don't know so much about it. It's astonishing how much we do not know about China. And I think it's very important that normal people also, not the studies, not the academician, learn a little bit more about China, because it's the big devil here, and you cannot have Chinese steel anymore. It's awful. Let's go down to earth and look at it. I entered China for the first time, and I like that expression here, post-Olympic in 2011. I didn't know anything about China. I don't speak Chinese. I didn't know anybody there, and I tried to build up a business there. And I did that. Perhaps a little trick, you have to learn about the history, because when you learn about the history of a country, you can relate to people, and suddenly they say, wow, he's interested in us. And at that time, I asked myself, I asked other people when I came back, and I was so impressed about that country, and said, listen, look, it's such a huge country. Can you tell me a city which is not Shanghai, not Beijing, not Hong Kong? Can you tell me another Chinese city? And most of the people couldn't at that time. Now I have to say, I have to add Wuhan, but otherwise, people don't know another city. There are 1.4 billion people living, and we don't know another city, which is astonishing. So this is an empire. And Mary, I'm very glad that you brought up yesterday the notion of the empire thinking, This is the only empire which is coming back. All the others are gone. Roman, Ottoman, Mongolian, Timur, even the 12-year-long one, didn't exist very long, So they're all gone, and they're coming back, and we should have lots of respect and think of that. In the early 1400s, 1420, 1430, they built a flotilla where the biggest ship, that was before Columbus, where the biggest ship was so large that you could put the 3 ships of Columbus 9 times on board. And they went they went out with gifts, and they wanted to explore the world, and they thought, no, it's not for us, and they burned the flotilla. These people, you have to take them very seriously. At that time, between 1100, 1200, and the end of 1700, they had 25%, more than 25% of the world GDP. We don't know that. We always think we were the big kings in Europe and America, and with our enlightenment and so on. They had more GDP than France, England, Germany, or Prussia, where it was, and Spain together. We don't know that. We want to have respect for them, before we talk about that. How much time do I still have?
55 seconds.
55 seconds. Then I keep the rest of my remarks for the next statement. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you for that. All right, last I'd like to introduce Thome. She's a project manager with AidData's Chinese Development Finance Program. Before joining AidData, she was a Schwartzman Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center's Kaiser Institute on China in the United States, and a visiting fellow at the Institute for National Defense and Security Research. So welcome.
Thank you very much. It's really difficult going last because I think we've covered like 30 different topics over the past hour. So I have the pleasure of picking the one I want to talk about the most. But unfortunately, I think I have more questions rather than responses or any answers. Before I dive into that, I just wanted to feature some research that just came out from AidData. I'm talking today in my personal capacity, but I just wanted to share in line with the question about the theme of today's discussion, Trans-Pacific security and allies. Research just came out today at AidData that looked at around 30,000 projects to 217 countries from over 1,100 Chinese financiers worth $2.2 trillion US. And what's really interesting is this money is not primarily only going to Chinese partners or neighboring countries, but the top recipients of that Chinese state-directed and unofficial sector financing are actually the United States. They've received over $202 billion US over the past 23 years. Of course, unsurprisingly, Russia is in second place with $172 billion. Australia is the third top recipient of this Chinese state-directed financing, $130 billion. Then you actually have Venezuela as the fourth top recipient with around $106 billion. So that's just something I think is really interesting to think about, that it's not only China's partners, some may call it allies, but also countries like the United States that are recipients of that state-directed lending, cross-border financing. I did want to pick up on the topic of military and dual-use technology because that is what I primarily study. Mark put it really well. I love talking about ports. I grew up in Duisburg, Germany, where CK Hutchison, a Hong Kong company, invested in the 1970s, 1980s to build a terminal there that actually came to some controversy when Costco tried buying a terminal, or tried buying a stake at a terminal in Hamburg, which was in 2023, 2022. Please correct me if I got that year wrong. But we're not only seeing this across ports, for example, we're seeing this across multiple dual-use technologies, right? We shouldn't only be thinking about overt military capabilities, but also dual-use technologies like shipbuilding. I know was a very popular topic, which I was very excited about over the past few days, but also space, satellites, 5G, subsea, undersea cables, data centers, e-government services, critical minerals, and I think I could keep on going for another 10 minutes. And I think primarily we have seen this in the past over the 2 decades in the Global South, talking about critical minerals in the Democratic Republic of Congo, looking at data centers built in Bangladesh, Zimbabwe, for example, also mining and ports in Peru, for example. But we're also now seeing that this is the case in countries like Germany, Greece, right, where we're seeing investments into ports, the building of nuclear power plants in the United Kingdom, for example, the Hinkley power plant. So I think these are very important implications that we shouldn't feel like we are far removed from that. I have a lot more questions, I said, so I do want to get to them. Challenges and risks, I like the question about, well, what can we cooperate on? What can we still agree on? And I think as a European, as part of this panel, I wonder, what can we cooperate on with the European Union to work together on with China? And what can we work on together with China? I know a lot of people always say climate change, aid, development finance, but some of these topics are facing really shifted in sentiment across the world. So what are new topics of agreement that we can find to work on together? I really like the point brought up by Michael, I believe, on security commitments. If we can't see any credible security commitments coming from China to its partners, what can we then really expect to see these groupings and organizations like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization to grow into and do in the future? What should we be expecting of that? Do they pose any challenge, risks, threats? As someone that really studies finances, finding markets, we're already in a vicious cycle right now where it's tariffs, trade agreements, and we find temporary solutions that are then replaced by other temporary solutions. Kaiser, are you saying we're going to be in this for the next 20, 30, 40 years?
Wow.
Oh, no. Well, what can we do to make sure that this doesn't keep on going over and over and over again? I wish I had the answer to that, but I'll let you find that one. And then, all right, I'll wrap it up here, but many more questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Leah wants to keep us busy for the next 2 hours. Thanks a lot. Thank you, Mary, for doing that. And for everyone, Dennis, would you like to respond to anything you have just heard? I want to open it up to Q&A from the audience in a minute or two, but just give you a quick possibility to respond.
Yeah, thank you. I think I'd like to address the grand strategy question. And let me tell you, the academic community and think tank community in Washington, we are at each other's throats on the issue of grand strategy in China. My own personal view is China doesn't have a grand global strategy. What it has is an East Asian strategy, and what it wants is primacy in East Asia. We have held primacy in East Asia ever since World War II. The Chinese feel it's their sphere and that we should back off from their sphere of influence, just as we declared with the Monroe Doctrine and now seemingly with Trump that this hemisphere is our sphere of influence. And so I think that is a key tenet. I think the other grand strategy, if you call it a grand strategy, is to change the international liberal world order. They think it's an anachronism. They look at the United Nations, the UN Security Council, who's sitting on it, and they say, why? Where's India? Where's Brazil? Why France? Why the UK? And they don't like, of course, the UN Human Rights Convention. They think it reflects our values, not necessarily their values. So I think that is part of the strategy to tweak and revise the international order. But I also think, as you pointed out, they are free riders on America as the world's policeman. In the Middle East, they take no responsibilities. We are the ones who operate, and they're quite comfortable with that. They can get their commercial interests served while not having to deal with the military and strategic problems of the Middle East. Finally, on U.S. strategy, I'll just make one quick point. We can love Taiwan too much. If we love Taiwan too much, the Taiwan government will move toward independence. If they move toward independence, China will react. And so we always have to have a policy with Taiwan of assuring them that we're not going to allow coercion, but deterring them from the idea that they need to have independence. That the status quo serves their interests. 23 million people on Taiwan have a great standard of living. They have the best semiconductor industry in the world. They don't need to go that route, and we need to keep reminding them of that.
Thank you very much. I would like to open it up to the questions, and you can all then respond when you bring in your answers to people from the audience. Yes, please, please.
Yep, D.P. Peterson, former Foreign Service. I guess my question is about China's, the United States used to have U.S. aid, which was sort of small dollar, and China would come in with multi-million-dollar projects, which at first were very well received, but I had this impression over time people started resenting them. They were being manipulated. You couldn't make the money off of it, and maybe there was the problem with, there was no human rights aspect to it whatsoever. And so I guess my question is, to what degree, you know, is that still working for China to make those huge investments in other countries that don't necessarily just work out and the country's not necessarily happy with it all the time?
Thank you. Could you just identify yourself?
Oh, sorry. Dean Peterson, former Foreign Service.
Thank you.
I think Leah should answer that one.
I'll take a first crack at this question. I think ultimately it comes down to foreign FDI or other outlets of cross-border. It comes down to what's your business model, right? What's your intent? I think U.S. aid versus BRI versus other private enterprises are very, very different. Having witnessed and gone to Africa and many other countries, which is our recipients of these type of fundings that you're describing, whether it be roads, whether it be housing of various sorts or stadiums, etc. Ultimately, it comes with both capital, but also a lot of infrastructure is coming in, right? I think that, and there's parts of it that's all attached. I think that fundamentally is a very different construct and concept that is given when the money is given vis-a-vis, forget the quantum aspect, but just really how is this being constructed and structured. A lot of it's structured on returns of various sorts. Is it returns of physical money coming out into regeneration, a return on some of these capital goods, infrastructure goods, or is it USA where it's much more humanitarian, as you put it. So I think these are two different things, but I think in the same side, this is all going down to the same question. So let me, and some our other panelists, let's go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, there's an old saying you hear often in the global south that when the Chinese come to town, we get a hospital. When the Americans come to town, we get a lecture. And I saw somebody write that on Twitter one day, and an American reply guy comes in and says, well, that hospital comes with strings attached, that trap diplomacy, blah, 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 blah. To which the African who originally posted it said, here comes the lecture. I think that we need to let the data speak. There's been a big shift in where actual investment has gone and where aid has gone. And there's also a lot of misunderstanding about the actual sources of lending in much, especially of sub-Saharan Africa, it's a lot less Chinese than you imagine it to be. It's still, a lot of it is the Bretton Woods institutions, and a lot of it is American lending. So I think, Leah, do you want to grab a mic and say a few words about this?
I will add very briefly, I do think that USAID and Chinese companies, or the Chinese aid and lending ecosystem, is very different, right? The Chinese ecosystem is far bigger, far more extensive, and a lot more decentralized actually than USAID was. USAID was primarily focused on programs, while now, for example, you have the DFC, which is still awaiting reauthorization. Am I correct, Mark? Yes, the DFC that actually came to the United States to build investments into infrastructure and other important projects globally. Of course, this has been a learning process. The Build Act was passed in 2019, was it? So a learning process about 6 years. It officially started in 2021. And of course, it's been kind of a little slow over the past few weeks and months, but hopefully that is a learning from Chinese counterparts about what U.S. agencies can be doing overseas. But again, I think that saying about building a hospital versus getting a lecture is very correct. Just looking at, for example, some of the studies put out by AidData about, for example, even just the speed of construction, right? I think it's about what are you looking for and on what terms, and you really need to carefully consider that. Are you looking for a hospital now in a year or two, or are you looking for a hospital that might be constructed in 6 years or might get abandoned in the future?
Thanks a lot. We all now have heard about AidData and how great they are. Thank you. Some marketing is always good. Yeah. Let's have the guy, the gentleman there. Yeah, with the gray hair. Yeah.
Ryan Sanders, and I have the distinction my mother was born and raised in China. So my question is, yesterday we heard about Russia in more of a military expansion model. Today we hear about China more of a commercial expansion model. With a commercial expansion model, you need customers to come back and buy your products. So in this grand strategy, what do you see China's plans on making sure that the world economy stays strong enough to continue to funnel into their economy? Because that's how they've grown in the past 20, 30 years, is we're buying everything from China. They're making lots of money. It gives them ability to expand. What happens if other countries become progressively poor? Where does China go on this long-term strategy?
That's a great question. I mean, I think that was directed toward me. You were looking at me the whole time, so I'm going to assume it was. Is that okay, gentlemen?
Sure, you first, and then we'll get.
Unfortunately, I only had the 6 minutes. I think there was a whole bunch that I wanted to say about the upside of this Chinese development model, and a lot of it is, they are very perfectly well aware of the need to continue to, and they are, I think, maybe doing more than any other country to build those models in those markets in the global South. Yes, it's a problem that in Brazil they can't make a $6 toaster. It's a problem that in any line of manufacturing that they're going to want to go into, they're going to face really insane competition. They're going to have to meet the China price, and they don't have the machine tools. They don't have the industrial robotics. But those machine tools and those industrial robotics are now very affordable to them from China. So a lot of them are looking, I mean, the Chinese path to industrial development is not one that they believe is entirely replicable. Otherwise they wouldn't keep calling it with Chinese characteristics. What they have done though is really opened up the menu, the possibility that there are other paths, sort of nationally determined paths to development, and a lot of them do involve laying down a lot of infrastructure, investing heavily in machine tooling and industrial robotics, building a robust manufacturing sector to serve a domestic market, and that is what China's enabling.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, then we get the next question. Pasood.
Hi, thanks for this great panel. I want to ask a question following up on what Vita responded to Michael earlier. So I take the point, so if we follow the Ukraine analogy with what might happen in East Asia with respect to a potential response to Taiwan militarily, how might we understand China's economic relationships with regional countries as to how that might limit their responses to a potential Chinese action? I'm thinking analogously about how many countries in Europe struggled to come up with a strong response to Russia in 2014 than in 2022, thanks to dependence, for example, on Russian gas or other situations. So, like for example, in Southeast Asia, China can control the supply of fresh water to half of the region, right, with the Mekong River. So yeah, just wondering if any of you might have any thoughts about that.
Robert, is that a question for you?
I mean, maybe someone on the security side.
Of Vita?
I mean, the simple fact is that there isn't a single country in the region whose main trading partner is not China. That China is more integrated into regional global supply chains, into regional trade networks than we can possibly imagine. I mean, there are two countries that really ought to be in the regional comprehensive economic. RCEP, the United States is not one of them. I mean, they're not there. We don't have a lot of leverage that way.
So I agree with that in relation to countries like regions like Southeast Asia. When we talk about Japan, the Philippines, even to a lesser extent South Korea, I think it's a different story. So in particular for Japan and the Philippines, Taiwan is essentially an existential issue. And so it would be a very different situation. We're talking, if the PRC took actual physical control of Taiwan, the U.S. would probably be incapable of fulfilling its alliance commitments to Japan, for example. Japan's almost all of its energy resources would be at China's mercy. Most of its imports, exports. The Taiwan Strait, which is so important for global shipping, for example, would be at China's mercy. And so, there's a lot happening there that isn't, it doesn't really exist when we talk about the most European countries and their relation to Ukraine. If I could just really briefly, I also wanted to respond to, I believe it was James, I think, who asked a question about like the Taiwan Strait issue. And I think this issue is not sort of the long-term sort of how can the status quo be preserved? And I think the answer is that it can only be preserved, and that the three parties involved realize that there is no way to resolve this situation. And so it is essentially like, it's one of those long-term, very uncomfortable situations that will remain uncomfortable for the long term, for the foreseeable future. Similar to the Cold War, but on a much, hopefully much smaller scale.
Thank you. Dennis, you wanted to respond?
Yeah, I just want to add on the Taiwan question and our allies. If you have not been to Japan recently, the Japanese attitude toward China has turned 180. The Japanese military is ready to fight and ready to fight alongside us. They have just set up their first operational command since World War II, and we are joining them in that operational command in Japan. They're buying 200 Tomahawk missiles. Their 2 helicopter carriers we are now converting to F-35 real aircraft carriers. The self-defense force is no longer the self-defense force that we all thought about in the past. Similarly, the Philippines. They have given us access to Luzon. Because the INF treaty is over, we now have tactical missiles we can put in Luzon and on the Japanese islands near Taiwan. So the bolstering of defense capabilities with our allies is very real. Now we're talking about submarines with the South Koreans. We're building submarines with the Australians. This will be a very necessary capability in the Taiwan Strait crisis. So while China is building up, we are not sitting by and not doing anything. And of course, we are creating drone swarms in order that we don't have to use fighter aircraft up quickly in a conflict. We're using AI much more than we ever did before. So the military balance is not shifting in China's direction in the way you sometimes hear it is in this area.
Thank you. When we keep James Lindsay's words in mind about the horrible effect and legacy and the implications of a great power war, so do you see a compromise possible over hegemony in East Asia? You know, China, obviously, as you outlined, they want to have hegemony. The United States doesn't want to give up hegemony, so war is unavoidable, it seems.
I think that intense competition is unavoidable. I want to be an optimist and say we at some point have to come to a modus vivendi with the Chinese. I think they have to understand. I was in a dialogue with the Chinese, and they said, we recognize you're a Pacific power, but you're not an Asia-Pacific power. And that has to change in the Chinese attitude. We have to share the Pacific and the Asia-Pacific. Now, can we get there? A lot depends on whether Xi Jinping and the Chinese leadership feel that's unacceptable. And they will challenge it, as they are challenging things with the Philippines in the South China Sea, right now around the Senkakus with the Japanese. The challenge is coming from China, and we've got to figure out how we're going to approach it.
One last word about that. What about Trump and the MAGA movement? MAGA movement needs to focus on America and not on the outside world. So will that have any implications?
The MAGA movement is very conflicted on this. If you listen to Elbridge Colby, who says he's a MAGA gentleman, by the way, I'm not sure what that means, he says, no, we have got to be out there in the Asia Pacific. In fact, we have to do much less in Europe in order to build in Asia. One thing that's going to show us something is the new national defense strategy that is supposed to come out soon. And that will be very interesting because you're right. People like J.D. Vance, Cotton, and others are saying we don't want to engage, we want to pull back. So I think the MAGA movement is not of one mind on this, and again, it will be interesting to see where the defense...
So it all comes down to the Donald.
Exactly, once again.
Thank you. More questions? This lady first. Can you introduce yourself and very briefly, please?
Yes, Nancy Capaccio, ordinary citizen.
Good.
Do any of your colleagues or people that you work with or associate with think of America as an empire in decline?
That's the question for Robert.
Gosh, you know, to be honest, I haven't heard that phrase. No one's brought it up with me. I mean, I've read it out there in the blogosphere. From my point of view, when I speak to foreigners, they want to know. They're very interested still in the U.S. market. They see a lot of optimism here. They think that the United States is still the place to be if you want to grow your business, if you want to thrive. They see our resources, our relatively low energy prices, not everywhere, but relatively low. They see America as an entrepreneurial place where you can thrive as a startup, you can fail, you can get your financing. European companies envy that. And so those are most of the reactions I get. And to Kaiser's point, I think that companies have tried to prosper in the Chinese market to some degree, but there has been a pullback there under President Xi because things have become a bit more difficult for foreign investors. So I still see a remarkable amount of optimism around the U.S. economy. And so that's how I would answer that question. I think people still look to the United States. And when I talk with foreigners from other countries and you start getting into, well, this country's better than that country, I like to ask the question, well, do people still try to, are there immigration in country X or is there emigration in country X? And despite the changes in immigration policy, people still want to come to the United States. So those are a couple of indicators I would put out there to answer that question.
For my Chinese interlocutors, the smart ones, I think they distinguish between absolute and relative decline. In terms of absolute decline, no, they wouldn't say that the United States is, maybe it's down temporarily, certainly not out. But relative to China, absolutely.
I would just say it comes down to capital market flows, right? If you look at it, the U.S. capital market is the strongest in the world, period. Especially in terms of entrepreneurial risk capital. I rephrase that because it's very, very difficult to get that kind of capital in other places around the world. Like really,
Hong Kong dwarfed the United States in terms of IPOs, capitalized IPOs.
Correct, but that actually does me from an international capital markets investor perspective. Well, it's a big pullback. So that while that is an IPO flip up, it's not a global perspective.
Thanks a lot. Let's get a few more questions. And Jason.
First of all, I'd like to say a big thank you to Mr. Kennedy for raising the question about fundamental differences between Chinese strategic culture and that of the West. And as a student in Chinese history, I could not agree with Mr. Becker more that China was for many centuries an empire on top of that of a current Marxist-Leninist regime. And given this, I do want to raise the point that China, though for many centuries was a great power, it has never been a naval great power. In fact, the concept of sea power never became a priority of Qing Dynasty until the arrival of European powers in the mid-19th century. And since then, China also did not really have a great performance in any of the naval engagements, like the First Sino-Japanese War. And Mr. Wilder also earlier said that PRC only had one naval engagement so far. And given all these histories, would you guys say that the determining factor in case in a war over Taiwan Strait between China and US and its allies will still be naval power? Or in other words, should the US and its allies still put naval engagements over the Taiwan Strait as the highest priority, or as the first war goal in a potential war between China and the US?
Yes. There are four options the Chinese have in conflict. The first is simply to take the outer islands near China. That can be done overnight. There are very few troops on those islands anymore. It would humiliate Taiwan, but it certainly wouldn't solve the problem. Second is decapitation, where the Chinese would fire missile after missile at command centers, the Taiwan leadership, airfields, and try to bring down the government that way. The third would be an invasion, very difficult, 100 miles of water. You look at D-Day was a success, but Anzio was not. Amphibious landings are very difficult to do, and we could destroy an amphibious attack very easily. But the one you mentioned is blockade or quarantine. And blockade and quarantine is a very difficult thing to deal with, because the Chinese Navy from a standing start could simply say commercial shipping has to be monitored by the Chinese, right? And so they would stop commercial ships and then turn them back. Taiwan only has about 2 weeks of energy supply, so this could work. The American response to that, and I've talked to Admiral Preparo, would be to, if the president decided to fight the blockade, you would reflag commercial shipping as American and send destroyers in with the ships. This immediately sets off the immediate confrontation between the United States and China. China would have to decide, do you stop them or do you let them go? So I agree. The naval aspect is the most likely, the most serious, the most difficult for us to deal with.
Thank you very much. I would like to get one more question in, and then there's coffee outside, and I would also like to invite everyone, because there's a second session after the coffee break. We break up here after some closing remarks at 1 p.m., and then there's lunch in Hamilton Hall, room 569. So everyone in the hall is most welcome to come along for lunch. It's a casual lunch, but it's not bad at all, not daily. So please come along at 1 p.m. to have lunch. But before we break up for coffee outside, one more question. Freya over there.
Shreya Ladd. I work on nuclear weapons policy at Stanford University. So my question is, I hate the Cold War analogy usually, but to tie together what you talked about, China's economy and its strategic posture, can China sustain a military/nuclear arms race with the United States? And secondly, can we? Because from what you said, it sounds like China can. And it can mobilize the garrison state necessary to sustain such an arms race, or at least it was in the Cold War. But the Soviet Union was unable to sustain something like this, and that led to the disintegration of the Soviet Union at the end of the Cold War. Can China do better, and can we keep up?
Very complicated question. Let me try very quickly. Number one, China is not the Soviet Union, and the industrial base in China and the capability of the Chinese economy is light years ahead of what the Soviets are. So I don't think we can make the argument that China can't sustain this level of military growth and nuclear power. We have some choices to make on the American side. One is the one that Senator Sullivan and others are pushing, which is the American Iron Dome. I frankly am not a believer in the American Iron Dome. I think trying to do a huge system like that, Israel is one thing, it's small geographically. I think we will spend billions of dollars and get nowhere on that kind of missile defense system. Golden Dome, I'm sorry. Well, yeah.
The Trump era.
The Trump, okay, we call it, you want to call it Golden Dome. Now, as to modernizing our own nuclear forces, yeah, we have some decisions to make. One of them is, do we want to go to tactical nuclear missiles? There is an argument to be made, and again, I'm not one of those strange love crazy guys, but there is an argument to be made that stopping nuclear escalation at tactical nuclear weapons is better than having full escalation. And there's a lot of talk about, do we want to build small nuclear weapons that you would use, for example, in a Taiwan Strait situation? That is a very big ethical dilemma. But certainly we need to modernize our nuclear forces. We've been slow to do that. There is some money being put into it. But we will reach a point where we have parity with the Chinese in warheads. Hopefully at that point, and the Chinese have said they will be willing to engage in some kind of nuclear arms control talks. Right now, they refuse because they say that we're not at parity. How can you ask us to reduce when you're so far ahead of us?
Could I make I know we're over time, a very brief amendment to my response to the question from Nancy, average citizen here. And I would say, she asked about the American empire, whether it's on decline. I think she was asking about America's ability to project its power and influence abroad. And I would say that with weakened institutions, democracy and rule of law in the United States, when those things are weakened, we have less ability to project our power and our influence abroad. And so if you don't mind me amending my answer, thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank all our speakers, all our respondents.